welcome to the Unmuted podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Waldman, founder of Scale HR, and we have an amazing podcast. Today with our guest, Kristen Liesch, and we'll bring her in shortly. But I just want to let you all know that if you have been following us along, great. We relaunched our podcast about a month and a half ago, and we've been dropping new episodes every week on Thursdays. And so we've been talking about HR, HR tech, and talent. And so today we're going to be diving into a topic, and it's called Turning Words into Action, Advancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So it's a fantastic topic. And actually, our next couple of episodes will focus on diversity and inclusion also, with a bit of, different topics based on that. And so you can sort of check out our podcast on our YouTube channel and also on our Scale HR website. And if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do so that you can be notified when new videos are published. Okay, so I just want to before I bring in Kristen, obviously being in Canada, Canada is actually one of the most diverse countries in the world, and actually one would even argue, that it is actually number one. And so just to give you an idea of our workforce, about 25% of Canadians were actually born outside of Canada, which is really interesting. I mean, I actually thought it was higher, but it's about 25%. 20% of the population speaks more than one language at home, which kind of makes sense. And then the other sort of interesting stats is about 1/4 of our population of 40 million actually lives with a disability, which is really interesting stat. And then this one's even more interesting, is that roughly 250 reported ethnic origins or ancestry in our population, which to me is basically we've covered the entire globe. So and then this other some interesting stat, just to paint a fuller picture: Canadian women 15 years and older represent nearly half of the labor force, and then today, compared to about 38% in 1976. So it's an increase of about 25%, which obviously has had a major positive impact on our country and families. And so, but even with Canada being such a diverse country, what's really interesting is in our organization today, when we're talking about how do we move past words into action and actually making impactful change and so on when it comes to diversity and inclusion in our organizations, is if you ask employees this question. So Deloitte had a really interesting stat: about 70% of employees have reported that their organization prioritized diversity, equity, inclusion, but only 35% said that the company has substantially followed through on their commitment, and only 15% reported that managers and senior leaders have been held actually accountable for meeting their objectives. So this, I guess you can say that this clearly demonstrates that there's a lot of talk, not as much action, and even less accountability. So, and it's always been a problem, and that's where I really want to sort of dive in to today's episode with our guest, Kristen Liesch, and I'm going to make fun of her because she is a doctor, PhD, and I've known Kristen for a long time, and so Kristen's based on the beautiful Vancouver Island, which is one of my favorite places on this earth, and she is the the co-CEO, I guess. I'll let her do it, but the co-founder of a fantastic organization called Tidal Equality. We'll share all of the links in the podcast episode, and she's going to help us figure out or unpack all of this in terms of how to move past words to action. So, Kristen, I just want to welcome you to the Unmuted podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. It is truly a pleasure to join you and to connect with your audience in this way.
Fantastic. So, so maybe you can just sort of give us a bit of an overview of what you do, what your awesome company does.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so as you said, I'm co-founder and co-CEO at Tidal Equality. We are a Canadian, like yours, woman-owned, woman-led business, and we exist in the world to help organizations and individuals build equality better. Because the fact is, like your stats reflected, we do not live in a world where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed and reach their full potential. And so our work falls into three buckets. We help organizations design equitable strategic plans for their businesses. And we also help organizations develop more equitable and inclusive products, services, systems, events, communications, you name it, with equitable innovation sprints. And we teach individuals to make more equitable decisions every day using our decision-making methodology called the equity sequence. So that's a little bit about us. We work here in Canada, but mostly in the US, in the UK, in Europe, with clients big and small.
Big and small. Fantastic. And so you talked about this product that you've come up with, and we're going to talk about that a bit later. But I just want to get right into it, into the big, elephant in the room. And that is, why is it so difficult for organizations to turn words into impactful action, but actually have meaning?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great question. I think there's two reasons. The first reason I'm going to get out of the way, and that's that there aren't actually that many organizations that have leaders at the top who really have the will to make equitable change. But I don't think that those are the people who are tuning into your podcast. So I'll just say sometimes there isn't the will, so there isn't the way, and we'll put that to the side. But for the other organizations, and again, I'll mention big and small in every sector, in just about every region, there are organizations that want to make equitable change, want to make their businesses more inclusive, more diverse, places where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. And the reason why they haven't been able to turn that into meaningful impact, I'll argue, is because they haven't actually been given the right tools. And so what I mean by that is when a person in an organization goes looking for support when it comes to building their diversity portfolio or their skills in that business, the landscape isn't actually full of opportunities for them to engage in that have a research backing, that have evidence of success, but the market does have a lot for them. Whether it's education around implicit bias, around microaggressions, around historical, marginalized populations, and so on, there's a lot of education available, a lot of really good education available. But as many of us know, knowledge doesn't translate into action without some kind of stopgap in the middle, some kind of tool that equips you to do that. And to illustrate that, we can think about this in terms of our daily lives. All kinds of us have aha moments about things about our lives, whether it's right down to the brass tacks of, I wish I could get better sleep, or I'd really like to move more in my day, and I know why I need to do it. But translating that into action is really hard. And in the scientific and research world, we call that the knowledge, intent, action gap, right? And so organizations experience that same issue. They might have enough knowledge in the business around why we need to make a change, or knowledge about implicit bias or different types of isms, but they don't have the tool that helps them turn that into action. So I'd say that is one really legitimate reason why a lot of organizations with right intent find themselves going, we've got a lot of input going on here, but we don't have a lot of outcome to show for it.
Right. I mean, like in the last couple of years, so there's been more, I guess, action that we've seen, and we've talked about this, before in our own private conversations and so on. I see a lot of sort of ad hoc things or actions that take place, and it could be because someone else did something, or someone else posted something, or it could be sort of like a hot topic. And so there's a lot of I find sort of one-off types of things, whether it be like a lunch and learn, or commemorating something, of what have you. And so, I mean, just being part of the hard of hearing community, obviously I have my own personal experiences, and I find that while those things are good, I don't know if they really do much to change things, actually change how an organization works. And so, would you agree with that statement that there have been more action, but I don't know if we're really getting a lot of outcomes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And it's kind of where we differentiate between outputs and outcomes. Here we are several years on from the start of the pandemic, from the murder of George Floyd, and all kinds of organizations making commitments to certain actions and intentions and statements and things like that. There's a lot of window dressing, and there's also a lot going on. To your point, there's a lot of events, there's a lot of education. And so when we read today the ESG or the DEI reports of some of the bigger organizations, we see that there's a lot happening. But we don't see a lot in terms of, for example, we've managed to increase our recruitment of underrepresented groups from this percent to this percent, or we've managed to retain and advance women and people of color from this percent to this percent, or we've seen engagement and satisfaction levels from these groups go from this to this. The outcomes are really lacking. The outputs, the things happening are there, to your point. But the actual material change in people's experiences, or speaking to some of the statistics you read earlier, I'd argue the fatigue is felt on all sides, and the individuals who have been waiting for their organizations to transform their intention into actual changes in the way they experience either their workplace, or if we're thinking from a consumer perspective, consumers waiting and anticipating to feel the products and services and things that they're consuming reflect their needs better, reflect their constraints better. That's not happening.
Very interesting. So, I mean, this topic, we can go on for hours, obviously, and but what can leaders and organizations do to start? I mean, if they haven't done anything, then where do they start moving from word to action? But but they are doing some action stuff, but they're not really getting the outcome. So how would you recommend that they transition and actually start getting some some outcomes that actually matter?
Well, I'd say whether you're starting from scratch or whether you're at a certain point in your organization's journey where you're needing some kind of a reset, I can't over communicate the need to have a why for what you're doing. I mean, like you pointed out, excuse me, a lot of organizations, their why, the truth of it, was reactive. It was responsive. It wasn't rooted in an actual true sense for the organization's need to do this. And where I would point people in terms of that reframing is in the following way. The most successful, resilient, sustainable organizations in the world are those that recognize that their consumers, their stakeholders, are an incredibly diverse set of people. Right. And that to be as successful as possible, they need to really well understand and meet the needs of those people. To me, that is the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion for innovation, for resilience, for success. And that repositions and reframes the whole conversation. If I say to a leader, if I had them think about, do you today really truly not only understand the diversity of your stakeholders, and not just as a set of like 4 avatars or some kind of uniform clump, but do you truly understand how diverse they are? Do you truly understand their needs? And do you know that you're meeting them? Many organizations and many leaders realize, oh, maybe we don't. That is the reframing an organization needs to begin to take a new approach to really truly centering DEI in all of their work, all of their operations, from communications to product design to UX design to event planning, like you name it. So I think that reframing of the conversation with the why for that business is critical as a first next step.
I mean, I've worked sort of, the last decade plus, quite heavily in the tech industry. And so obviously when, companies build software products, they have like a strategy or a process as to how they build software. There's a whole, sprint, whatever you use, waterfall method, doesn't really matter, but there's always checks and balances. And so some of the ones that I've worked with recently have, as part of the process, they actually overlay an element of, diversity, equity, inclusion through, accessibility, depending on what the software product is, right? And so, it's really interesting because they do some of them anyway, do a really good job at ensuring that the software that they're building is actually accessible to their stakeholders. Now, I've always said, well, HR can do the same thing. Their product is a little different. It's not a piece of software. It's people. It's, future employees or current employees. Yet they still, struggle with sort of making that connection. But I just wanted to just ask the question about, obviously in a lens of shifting from, talking about something word to action to outcome. So how do you ensure that what organizations do last and then it's actually, sustainable? So another way of putting this is it about programs and activities, or is it about mindset and so how you operate, or a combination of both? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, once an organization has a sense for the why, after that, it kind of becomes, what are the nudges you have in place that can ensure as many people as possible are operating toward that future? I mean, you think, I alluded before to having a desire to get better sleep, for example, or to move your body more. You've got the intention, right? You've maybe got the why, which is, whatever, I've got bags under my eyes, or I'm having, restless sleep or what have you. But then it really comes down to nudges. And today we live in a world where we have the luxury of all kinds of nudges available to us through apps and things like that. But if you want something to really be sustainable, it needs to be practical. It needs to fit into a person's day-to-day work, whether they're an HR leader, whether they're in product design, because you're not going to get people on board with something if it's only relevant to a small group. To what extent is that really going to spread through an organization and be sustainable? And I'd say, many leaders in all kinds of businesses know that when you really need to make a transformation, you do get everyone involved, but you also ensure that they understand how it's relevant to their work. So my suggestion in this context is, whatever intervention you're looking at choosing, you ask yourself, is this as relevant to my head of HR as it is to an individual contributor in my customer care center? Because if the answer to that is no, then you're only going to have a certain number of people who are carrying the responsibility for embedding it in the business. So that's number one. Is the thing you're doing relevant to everyone in your business? Number two, is it applicable by everyone in your business? In other words, everyone can be taught something, but can everyone use that thing? So this is where I really zero in on a decision-making tool. We'll talk about equity sequence in a bit, but if there's other options out there, what you want is something that doesn't require a person to take a huge amount of time outside of their day-to-day work, that doesn't require them to bulk up on other education. It needs to be something that's applicable as well. Because if you don't have that, you're adding layers that, as we all know, and especially tech businesses know, we don't have time for the extra layers. Many times we're like building the plane as we're flying it, right? It needs to be practical and it needs to be agile. It needs to be something that everyone can use. And unfortunately, in the DEI space, there aren't a whole lot of options in that regard. But that's definitely something that I'd encourage leaders and HR leaders in particular to look for.
So that's actually really interesting that you mentioned them, those points. I mean, I think, a lot of our, listeners are going to find quite a bit of value in what you're talking about. Can you talk about any case studies or any examples of personal experiences of organizations that have gone through the process of talking about something or to action to outcome? I mean, I think companies are always looking for, leaders or, people that have played a lead role, in this, and just learning from them as to how they do things. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah. Well, definitely for me. And I would also put this question to your audience as well, just to have them identify for themselves this gap, because I think a lot of us can point to organizations who've said they've had an intention to do something, but not often can we read about the results or see the results, watch about the results. So I think it's just important to identify that there is that gap, which is why you're asking me the question in the first place, right?
Right.
Yeah. And honestly, that's a gap that our organization, that we recognize, that we saw, what people really need a way to fill that gap, to produce those outcomes. So you're going to hear me use some examples, and to your audience as well. And these are examples of clients of ours. And I've mentioned equity sequence. I really, to be honest, don't have examples for you outside of our client base, not because I don't think that they exist, but they're out there, I'm sure. So one example I can speak to very publicly, because they have as well, and they're probably one of our longest standing clients. Jeff, you've heard me talk about them before, but that's Virgin Media O2, based over in the UK. And they have used equity sequence as a decision-making tool in that business in all ranks and roles. But speaking specifically in terms of the work of the people in the human resources department there, just to give you one example, they have a returner policy. So we're thinking now about people who go away on some sort of leave, and then they return, and the organization was very kindly giving people returner welcome back boxes. And those boxes were filled with pretty standard things. And most of the time, the boxes were, who did they have in mind when they were giving those boxes out? It was usually like mothers coming back from a maternity leave, that kind of thing, or fathers as well, parents coming back from maternity leave. But they sat down and they thought, you know what, are returner boxes really all that inclusive? Have we, really thought about the conditions under which people in our organization go away on leave? Are we leaving things out? And through using equity sequence and getting together and workshopping on this, they realized, no, actually, people go on all kinds of leaves. They go on bereavement leaves. Some people, again, thinking about the childbirth situation, have loss of children and things like that. So there are all kinds of reasons why people take leaves, and they did not have a way to really welcome those people back into the organization and the culture, other than that one context of parental leave for a mother or father, a parent. So they took this realization and they created a whole new host of returner boxes that are filled with things that they engage their ERGs to help them create, might I add. So they're engaging a lot of people who have different experiences inside the organization to inform and contribute to what these have inside of them. So it's just a small example of a gesture the organization makes in that product to let their organization know, their people know, we see you, we hear you, we know you're not all going away for the same reason, and you all have other needs when you come back. That's not a policy related one, but I can tell you that Virgin Media has made all kinds of other policy changes as well. But it's one that we can imagine, right? Touch and feel. Another example I'll give you, I can't tell you who this company is, but I can tell you we all know who they are and have probably used their software. And they realized, we've got a real representation gap here in leadership. We are, by and large, white, middle class, mostly male in our leadership ranks. So they took a very specific look at their promotions process, and they looked at it through the lens of equity sequence. And something they realized was they had a real tendency to backfill positions, and they weren't always opening up opportunities to either external candidates or candidates internally that weren't kind of just sitting there in the next position. So they took that insight. They saw the problem that they had. They made changes to how their promotion process works. They opened it up to external candidates and other candidates in the organization to kind of expand that candidate pool. And since they did that, they've gone from 2% representation of underrepresented groups to 8% in a year. So I mean, that's not a huge leap, but in leadership ranks where we don't actually have a great number of leaders, it's relatively important. And so these are both examples of different things related to the work of people in human resources where they weren't told what to do. I want to really emphasize this because I know a lot of organizations in your audience, they're not big businesses like VMO2. They don't have internal DEI teams, right? They don't have consultants that they can pay on an hourly. And I really want to emphasize that making the kinds of equitable innovations that improve a business from an inclusion, equity, justice standpoint, they don't require professionals. They can be supported by professionals, but actually making these kinds of changes can be made collaboratively with people if they have the right skill set. Like anything you might train your people in, like agile or lean, right? You can be equipped to do these things on your own. And both of those examples achieved measurable either employee engagement results or promotions profile results, and each of them was done just using a decision-making framework to identify those opportunities to make change.
Those are those are actually excellent examples because it showcases to one critical thing is that these things that organization can do don't have to be big.
Yeah.
They can be really small and targeted, but but the impact is huge because it it they've been well thought out and it's based on there's a noticeable connection to what the company is doing. So it doesn't have to be some grandiose big thing that everybody's always looking for the big splash,
Yeah.
and you don't need that. That's not what people are asking for. But the work itself in actually identifying some of these things, that's the key part of it, and then engaging stakeholders to go through the process of actually coming up with options. Look, I mean, in HR, I mean, like if you're a leader, like a CHRO of a 500 person company, there's 500 brains out there that you can tap into. So why wouldn't you, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk quickly about, so you created this really cool product called the equity sequence. And I know that it's gone through a lot of, iterations over the years. And I had the chance to actually look at it a few years ago, pre-pandemic. So I'm sure that it probably changed, quite a bit. But what is it exactly, the equity sequence? And then how does it help organizations move from word to action?
No, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I did. Yeah, you were one of our very first kind of pilot users when it dawned in its digital form. Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, we saw this gap. We saw a lot of people in organizations with an intent and a desire to make equitable outcomes and a real question about the how. And the products and services available by and large are, they're tricky. In Canada, your Canadian audiences, they might be familiar with things like GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus. And I sometimes joke, and no offense to the people who work in that space, that it takes a master's degree to understand how to use it and a master's thesis to produce your analysis, right? Like,
yeah,
it's a bit of a joke, but it's really challenging. It's not something that a frontline worker is going to be able to wield practically in their work. So we saw this gap and we knew it needed to be closed. But we also knew that there was a lot of good research that shows us how to equip people to make innovations of certain types in their work. And I alluded before to lean and agile. So equity sequence is a decision-making framework. It is not unlike lean or agile, but for more equitable and inclusive outcomes and systematic, continuous equitable improvement. And very simply, the equity sequence is a sequence of 5 very simple questions that we teach people to ask in their day-to-day work and decision making. So we've used examples from HR, right? They might have applied equity sequence to our returner box program, applied it to our promotions process. But I can tell you we have people applying it to the gym membership structure at my climbing gym in Boulder, Colorado, and teachers applying it to their caregiver communications in September, and bankers using it on their fraud detection policy. So I mean, like, it's applicable.
Okay.
Wow. Right? You can apply equity sequence to any kind of decision, regardless of sector, role, even rank. Like my 11-year-old daughter uses equity sequence when she plans a club at her elementary school. So that's just to illustrate how practical and usable it is by just about everyone. So the 5 questions, what do? In a nutshell, they help a person spot where bias has crept into decision making. And I say that without judgment entirely. Why? Because each of us has bias. Every human has implicit bias, and it shapes our decision making. It shapes our assumptions. It shapes our work, whether we want it to or not. It's a fact. It does it to me. It does it to you, right? But it helps people spot it once it's at play in a decision, a design, a product, a service, an event, a communication, you name it. They can see it. And then it guides them towards making efficient, effective changes to that thing that make it more equitable and inclusive, right? So I gave you those examples of the returner box and the promotions process, but another one might be, and this is from the admissions world that can translate to HR as well, are criteria sets. You know, you look at your criteria set, whether it's in a job description or in, you know, some other set of criteria that you're using to assess candidates, you can see where did that piece of criteria come from? You know, who is that designed by, for, with, and without? Like, is this really getting us? So it guides people to see the opportunities, very practical in their work products, that can be changed to be more equitable and inclusive. And so we teach people equity sequence, like I said. Online, we've got a public platform and a very affordable course there that people can use to get certified and then go off and running with the equity sequence. And we teach it in organizations as well.
So we'll also share the actual link so, you know, people can actually find out more, you know, have more information about it. I actually like it because, you know, obviously when you're talking about, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, there are so many things, right? And I've shared in the past, you know, with you that it is impossible for anybody or HR practitioner, you know, we're talking about HR, to be fully versed and knowledgeable and an expert in every single possible thing that would be something different in an organization. So there needs to be like a framework or a mindset or a process or something that they can use and go through. And that's why I really liked it. And I probably shared that bit of feedback, you know, way back when. My memory is terrible, so I don't remember what I told you, but I'm sure that I probably said, you know, something about that. So you mentioned something about bias. And so I just want to just shift gears, you know, a little bit, because when we're talking about unconscious bias, and so there are different schools of thought out there. And I know that you and I have talked about this, you know, several times, you know, over the years. So what is your take on unconscious bias? You know, what everyone talks about and wants to know is, can you eliminate it? Yes or no, or, you know, something sort of in between.
Well, I mean, the science on that is super clear. There is no such thing as eliminating unconscious or implicit bias, because very simply, right, what is it? It's implicit bias, cognitive biases. These are shortcuts our brains take to make sense of a complex world, large sets of information. I mean, if we didn't have those shortcuts, we wouldn't be able to operate in the world, frankly. But the problem is our implicit biases are informed, right, by our socialization, by our context, by our culture, and they become, right, the word unconscious. So we're not aware necessarily of how they're at play in how we interact with others and make decisions, right? So they're a fact. There's no getting rid of them. Some of the best science today shows that with a whole lot of input and effort, people's implicit biases can shift a little bit over time, but not enough to materially change the outcomes of our decisions in day-to-day work and decision making. Mindsets a little bit, but again, those outputs, those outcomes, not so much. And so you might be asking, I know you're not going to ask it because we've had this conversation before, but your audience might be like, well, then what's this thing about unconscious bias training, right? Like, what's that for?
Right.
You know, and the fact is, unconscious bias training as a thing, it emerged kind of in the 70s on the tail end of those justice movements of the gender equality movement, the social rights or civil rights rather movement, gay rights movement. but they didn't come from people who were experiencing the bias and discrimination. Unconscious bias training came from the corporate legal counsel in large organizations with a need to basically, and I'm euphemizing here, but like cover their butts on a legal standpoint. They needed to have something in place that they could point to if they were ever dragged in front of the Equal Opportunities Commission to say, oh, but we do this thing to mitigate for bias, right? So the origin story, for any of you who are like fans of Marvel and stuff like that, origin stories matter, right? Because they shape the thing we've got. So it wasn't actually ever intended in the first place to transform behaviors and outcomes. It was intended as a risk mitigation strategy. And so because that intent wasn't built into it, we actually haven't seen the results. So we're 50, 60 years away from all of that work. And there hasn't been evidence to show unconscious bias training changes anything about people's biased behavior decision making. And in fact, as will probably resonate with people in this audience, when it is brought to audiences and groups, it can create the very opposite effect of what you want. It can create backlash. It can make people feel like they are the problem. It can vilify certain groups and individuals. And because it leaves people going, okay, so now I know about this, but what do I do about this? And there's the cliff, right? They don't know what to do about it. They're not told what to do about it because, in fact, they can't really at that point. It doesn't help the process, right? It doesn't actually lead to anything helpful. So what I would say to people is, and to your earlier point, you said, HR leaders, DEI leaders, anybody, we can't actually become experts in all dimensions of diversity and experience and bias and discrimination. We can't. We can go on a lifelong journey of curiosity and learning, and I would encourage everyone to do that. But we can never mitigate for all biases, all circumstances, because all these things are plastic. They're changing. Our social context changes, people's experience changes. Even, myself, the types of bias I might experience in my lifetime are going to change based on circumstances, economic, age-related, disability-related. So we cannot boil the ocean. What we can do is take tools like the equity sequence and take the work that's in front of us and decision by decision, time after time, make them more equitable and inclusive. And in that way, we start to shift entire systems. And I don't want to downplay, you mentioned these don't need to be grand things. And yet over time, they can produce really significant results. And I'll use a quick example from Virgin again, because again, they speak about these things very publicly. Anyone can Google them. But during the pandemic, they were learning equity sequence, and it came to light that there was like a whole unserved market in the UK of people living in poverty who didn't have access to broadband services. And we all remember that at that time, broadband became more important than ever, right? Kids were learning online, people were working online, and there was a huge segment that was underserved by the broadband services in that country. So when those decision makers recognized that gap and they arguably innovated and created a product that met the needs of that population, not only did that expand market share, but think about it on an individual level. What did that mean to those many people living in poverty who now had accessible, affordable internet access, right? Yeah. So these decisions we make, they can sometimes seem small and only impact a few people, but the same kind of framework can be used to make sweeping decisions that have significant impacts on people's lives. And so I would never kind of want someone to think too small. You never know what kind of insight you're going to glean from this kind of thinking that can have monumental impact on people.
I mean, that example that, you just gave is major example. It's big. It's huge. I mean, obviously, most people who work in an organization today don't have that ability to impact on a grand scale like that. But don't forget, I mean, it, like cause if you are able to create positive change for just even one employee, on a like an inclusion lens, then you're doing something positive and good. And it really boils down to, being comfortable asking questions. And so I think that's what your, equity sequence helped you do. So getting to the end here. So if there's one thing that you can tell our listeners if there's anything that they can sort of take away from what we've talked about today, what would be that one thing?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump on what you just said, which is about getting curious and asking people what they need, right? And maybe the best thing I can leave them with is I'm going to just assert, I'm going to tell them, you can make equitable changes to the way you work that have meaningful impact on the people that you see and work with every day, and even some you don't. And maybe just giving another example to your point, the one I just gave about pricing and broadband services, not everybody here has that kind of lever to pull, right? But I'll leave you with another example. Sure. And I want everyone who's listening to think about decisions like this, that they could have the opportunity to innovate. So we had just a team leader learn equity sequence. They were in another telecom in the US. But anyways, they're just a team leader. And they run meetings every Friday, stand-up meetings with their team to kind of run through the past week and look ahead. And they were learning equity sequence for the first time. They applied it to that meeting, this meeting. I'm going to see if there are opportunities to make it more equitable and inclusive. And something that they realized was, what? I'm hosting my meeting Fridays, 4 p.m. Consistently, I'm noticing that the parents on my calls are cameras off. They don't seem really engaged. They're more engaged really. I don't know what's going on here, but realized, what? As a person, they did not themselves have children. And what they realized was, those parents on the call Friday at 4 p.m., they might have kids coming home from the bus drop off, or maybe they're actually having to take the call in the car while they go pick up the kids. Like, I'd never thought about this before, right? And the parents on the call, we all know people who've not wanted to reveal that, like, my parenthood status makes my work difficult sometimes, right? They weren't piping up, but she realized this. What did she do? Quick pulse check with the team. We'd like to change the time. When's a good time? They changed the time. That's all they did. It's a small modification, right? But what did it have as an outcome, as a result? Those people on the call who were parents, they had the cameras on, they were engaged, they were visible, but they also felt seen, heard, included, and considered, right? That's what this is ultimately all about. And asking the right questions can help us get there.
100%. I mean, obviously, it's difficult when it comes to planning a meeting or, doing something, with a group of people. Obviously there are competing interests and so on. But, this is a very good example of where, you're seeing something happening, and it's a negative happening with negative outcomes or no outcomes. And so that is that sort of trigger to say, okay, well, let's look into this. And then it's just a matter of just asking some questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things about HR people, they need to be comfortable asking those questions. So, Kristen, I just want to thank you for being here. Obviously, I could go on, forever and talk to you. Like, you're one of my favorite people in the space. And so I do appreciate you being here. And so we will share all of Title Equality's links, the equity sequence, how you can get a hold of Kristen and her partner, Anna. Don't forget that if you haven't, hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel, do so that you can be notified when new episodes and just other videos are actually published and dropped. Our podcast is also available on our website as well at goscalehr.com. And we will be dropping more episodes in the coming weeks and talking about HR, talent, and also HR tech. The next couple of episodes over the next few months will be about diversity, equity, inclusion, and also people with disabilities as well, which is personal to me. Kristen, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And thanks to your audience for listening. Audio Jungle.